Okay, I am recording this intro around mid-March, and my guest today is Graham Tuttle, who you may know as the Barefoot Sprinter. Graham is someone I was thinking about having on for a while. I actually reached out to him months and months and months ago, but our schedules just didn't align until recently. And the reason that I want to talk with Graham is he's put out some interesting YouTube videos over the last year or so about his transition from working with barbells and traditional weights, so whether it's powerlifting or bodybuilding modalities and kind of shifting to what I would call more of a practical style of training, really focusing on sandbags and lifting odd objects, more along the lines of what you might see of strongman training. And the reason that I wanted to get Graham on specifically is not just because he uses sandbags and makes videos about it. When he talks about training, he really talks a lot about building capabilities and building capacities. And he really looks at it from sort of a different way than we do, because at Wild Strong, we really talk about building options and capacities and capabilities. But we really sort of look at it in terms of a community health model where Graham, I think, because he does work with athletes and things like that, is really looking at it from more of a performance angle. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. We do come at things from slightly different ways, but I think it made the conversation more interesting. And actually, we ended up spending a lot of time talking about things I hadn't anticipated, which I think was good. So in the end, we actually only talk about sandbag training a little bit at the end, but I did learn a little bit more about his philosophy and how he thinks about training. And it's something that has got me thinking about the way we do things at Wild Strong as well. And I think it's just always nice to have conversations with people, who have slightly different perspectives on things. So I hope you enjoy this one. If you do, please go ahead and leave us a nice review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Always go ahead and leave a comment just because they're nice to listen to and nice to read. All right. Thanks.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
All right, I'm here today with Graham Tuttle, and you might know him as the Barefoot Sprinter. He's someone I've been following for a long time, and I wanted to get him on specifically because about 6-7 months ago, he started putting out a series of videos on how his training had changed and how he's been thinking about certain kind of training modalities a little bit differently. But also, I just wanted to get him on because I think he's a really good thinker. I think he does a great job of synthesizing different sources, different ideas when we're talking about capabilities and fitness and exercise and all these things that I like to think about. So I'm really happy to get him on. So Graham, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
I always start off pretty much the same question is, who are you and how'd you get here? So could you just tell the audience a little bit about you?
It's funny. I ask myself the same thing every day.
That's a deep philosophical question.
Who are you? Where are you? My name is Graham Tuttle. I am also known as the Barefoot Sprinter in most of the social media spaces. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, aspiring author. I don't think you can say that until the book officially publishes, but we'll see. I have been working basically my whole life to become more athletic. As a kid, I was very unathletic, awkward, bad eyesight. Great looks, though. Unfortunately, poor hair. And that did not get me on the sports teams I wanted. And so I went through a lot of just suffering sports, track, cross country, rowing, and which taught me a lot about my body. That transitioned to strength training, which was also beneficial. But unfortunately, I didn't have the context to be able to know how to do it well. And that led to a bunch of poorly rehabbed injuries and chronic pains that slowly started to ebb away at my confidence and my ability until about my mid-20s, I realized I felt like a 40-year-old and I felt hypocritical for being a personal trainer trying to help people be healthy when I couldn't even move myself. And that's when I started a more intentional journey to figure out what's going on with my body. How could I start to both improve my pain points while also not losing continuing to improve my performance, I'll say that. And over the past several years, I've been able to actually improve my body to a much more strong, resilient state while also improving my performance and being able to communicate the things I learned along the way to people via books, programs, social media.
Great. That's a good intro. I guess one of the things I might as well get out of the way right away, because we talked about it before we started recording, is you use the word athlete quite a lot. And I know you have a good reason for it. It's back when I used to be a CrossFit coach, years ago. I remember in CrossFit, we used the word athlete. And as I moved away from CrossFit, I myself stopped using it because I think the lens that it made sense to me was in terms of, sports, this idea of sportification, which is one of these ideas I have an issue with. Because really, when I think about it, I think about trying to build up capabilities of individuals and communities just so that they can sort of live the life they want to live. I know you use the word optionality quite a lot, and I like that as well. But could you tell me about using the word athlete, and what do you mean when you say the word athlete to help people become more athletic?
Okay, well, those are two different words. Athlete is just from the Greek, it's the root word for one who competes. So, and I define competition as caring. So you put some energy into something and you care. And I think that's important, but it's not specific in terms of, we're talking about physical ability. So you could care about the stock market trade you made. You could care because, and by care, I mean, not just like, I hope the best. It's like, no, you put some actual energy, some actual consequence on the line. So this is where you get to esports athletes and business athletes and tactical athletes, or people like to throw that word in. It's like, well, it's true in so much as they're actually putting consequence and real skin in the game, so to speak. That's different than athletic. Athletic is, as I define it, a access to your basic human abilities. And so there's a suite of abilities I would consider to be essential, and they scale in capacity with with sprinting sitting at the top. And the people who have access to those full human abilities or capacities would be athletic. And so those are different things in some terms. So you also run into the issue of fighting uphill when you think of a cultural awareness of a word. I think it's important just to understand that athlete and athletic may come from similar roots, of just different words. Yeah.
That's a good answer. I like that idea of focusing on capabilities. And that kind of ties into my next question. So, you've been doing this for a long time. You've put out lots of programs, and we were talking about this off camera about, how when you've been around, as a coach for a certain amount of time, you kind of have all these different products and programs and things. And then, eventually you come to a time where you kind of have to winnow things down a little bit and keep focus. But one of the programs I wanted to talk about is a program that you don't have in the current form anymore, but I know it's evolved into something new. This idea or this program, the backyard athlete. And I thought that one was interesting because it kind of came at, I think, perhaps at an interesting inflection point for you, because in the intro to the book, you sort of talk about the why of that program, and you kind of realized that there were certain bottlenecks or barriers that were preventing people from engaging in the activities that were meaningful for them. So can you kind of talk about that program, the ideas behind it, and then we can kind of tease that apart and talk about what it evolved into?
Yeah. And I'm also seeing this in the context of the other question. So I started off with this program called the Unbreakable Athlete. And by those, in some sense, using the word, okay, if you think about what the word athlete means in a larger context, it's a person who's a person who competes. Mm-hmm. The underlying supposition is that you have the ability to do that. And so when you say that you are an athlete, it's without specifying that. So for example, if you think of, I'm a CrossFit athlete versus I'm an unbreakable athlete, or I'm a backyard athlete, one of those has a specificity to it. So CrossFit versus pool versus, like little billiards, or football, American or otherwise. The specificity of that implies, okay, this is what I actually am caring about. But when you keep it more open-ended with like a general term that refers to either access, which was the point of the backyard men, is like everyone has a backyard or some equivalent of that. And so the backyard athlete is the idea of like, you can go out and, perform in this context. And the Unbreakable Athlete was the first program that I made with these high aspirations of training youth soccer players back at the time. And the goal is to be able to prepare somebody for that context. And I think that's the thing, is athlete becomes such a loaded term because there's a lot of things that are baked into competition, and some of those fair, some of those otherwise. And if I've only just gotten to know you, but I would imagine that the things that you dislike about the typical use of the word athlete is a lot of ego wrapped into it, a lot of comparison, a lot of one-sided objective thinking when it comes to ability, and that kind of wraps into I'm an athlete. There's a certain air about the use of that I think turns people off. But the word itself is just, to me, referring to someone who's willing to, and you'd also like to think able to, put some energy into something, which I think is important, because there's a reason brands like Nike have taken off so strongly, because it's like, just do it. There's a certain level of like, be battle ready. We look at movies like 300 with the Spartans and the war stories we tell. I think Christopher Nolan's doing an Odyssey movie coming out this year. Like, the narratives we tell have something about like people who are willing to sacrifice, who are willing to go forth bravely and do something. So to me, that's what the spirit of being an athlete entails. However, it also can get co-opted to mean something like better than. And I think that's where you start to run into issues, specifically when you look at something that's very essential and important to human culture, like movement. And that's where, when you start to muddy the waters of a movement practice, which scales everything from learning to breathe, which is about as intimate as you get, to learning to move, which is our first primary source of education as children, all the way through playing sports, which is a point of camaraderie, connection, community, all the way up through physical therapy, which is learning to be in touch with your body, to training, which is just a practice of being in touch with your emotions. That's a really powerful thing. And when that gets tainted by this idea of comparison and better than, I think that's the issue. To me, though, the underlying spirit of an athlete is the one who's willing to show up. And that, I think, is powerful. Now, the question of, if you're looking at the raw data, the bits, the athletic part, that's what I started to notice. So when I started with this Unbreakable Athlete, and I was like, you do all this stuff. And, as the side, I had these little throwaway, like the little 3 and 5 video series for the feet and for the hips and for the shoulders, because, I had a few injuries at this point. I was like, well, people need this stuff. And pretty quickly, what I realized is that unless you're a very high level performing individual physically, meaning like you can do a lot of stuff, when it comes to the social media world, it's hard to gain the attention of do my high level program. And for whatever reason, I just do not have the personality that attracts a lot of professional athletes. I've trained a few, but I tend to just get more the everyman. I don't know why, but I have my thoughts. I couldn't be with my hair. So I built this program, this Unbreakable Athlete, and I was like, okay, well, great. Well, we'll just do some throwaway pain fix. But I very quickly realized that people, like, that's what was top of mind. So when you talk about a pain point, people, okay, my feet hurt, or I got plantar fasciitis. And I started to think back, well, I had a lot of problems. There's no way I could have actually done this program at the beginning. So I spent some time focusing on this foot and this hip and the shoulder program, made a few versions, improved it. And what I noticed is this common theme of like, well, people are doing this program, but then they're getting stuck. And I heard this over and over again, which would be, I'm 98% better, but I still have this one thing, or like this improved, but then that happened. And I started to notice that people were like spending, it was a 28-day program at the time for the feet, for the hips, and they would do it and then redo it and redo it. I'm like, you're spending 3, 4, 5 months on this, what's meant to be like just a reconnection program with your body. And so since then I've shortened those to 10-day programs just to really to improve the gestalt of the feel like this is, hey, you can get in, get out, let's move. And just, this is not supposed to be a long-term project here. But I realized that people were not progressing into anything bigger. And I was like, okay, there's a disconnect here between what people actually think is possible. And that's when I started to really reflect on the context within which what we do matters. And so I'd say the biggest difference between the backyard athlete and this original case was realizing that there's a set of skills, movement abilities, that pull your body into action that you cannot back into with a bunch of correctives. Meaning if you do a calf raise or a shoulder external rotation or a breathing exercise, that part focused thinking does not actually combine. So for instance, the lesson of Frankenstein's monster, the human is more than the sum of the parts. We're not just an elbow attached to a forearm attached to a hand. Like there is actual intelligence somehow sewn into this thing that provides a system made out of these nested smaller pieces. And how do you get people to start to do that? Well, you have to get them, even though it's nice to have an introduction with wiggling your toes and flexing your ankle, you have to get people to start thinking about these larger movements like throwing and swinging and hanging. And at that time, I defined about 28. The recent iteration, especially thoughts I put through in the book, I lump those into about 10 categories that work kind of sequentially. Everything from sitting, getting off the ground without your hands, all the way up to sprinting. But the spirit motivating it was the same, which is, hey, there's a thing that you need to be able to do, and that thing is only possible if you do it, and it's called forth. What the recent thing I've been doing with this book is that thing is also called forth from your context, which I'd be interested what you hear, the sportification. I just assume what you mean is the quantification and numbering of everything, as opposed to just like making a game, because I think gamification is incredibly valuable. It's how we create play and fun, which is different than commodifying things into, let's say, monetizable sports, so to speak, which is just random categories of, I'm going to make this a thing and I'm going to turn money into, or make money from it. But what you do is the context of your movement pulls you forth. And so the first step is just feeling and moving your body, but then you plug those into movement, and then those movements need to plug into context, which is something that actually pulls you forth. So that's been the evolution of my thinking with that. But the backyard athlete really bridged as a, let's say, or function as a bridge to help people actually think less and move more, to get them out of their head, stop thinking about that old plantar fasciitis injury you had 2 years ago, and start to focus on, hey, there's an actual thing that you need to be able to do.
That's a good answer. Yeah, it's interesting you're using the word pull forth. And, one of the things we talk about a lot in our course is this idea of elicitation, which is it just means to pull out, and I think you kind of dabbled in some of the constraints-led approach stuff, but this idea also of affordances, of setting up this environment that kind of invites people to engage with them. I really liked what you were saying about not falling into that reductionist trap. And it's one of the things that Dan Edwards, who's a parkour practitioner, he always makes this distinction between, practical movement. He doesn't use the word functional movement. He uses the word practical movement of just like doing the thing. In parkour, you train to do the thing. There's no judge who decides whether or not you did it well or artistically. It's like, did you jump from here to there? Did you get from A to B? So he always talks about this idea of task-based versus rules-based. And that's kind of, when I talk about sportification, you're right. I guess we should define some terms as I use them. So I think that play and games and playful activities are very important. I don't generally use the word gamification, even though I think it might be the best word, because I think we can also see those sort of dark design patterns that we see sometimes, in, I don't know, whatever, pay to play games, certain ways that websites are designed, the way that social media and algorithm are designed. Sometimes you see these games, like I imagine Roblox or something like that, where they're gamified, in a way that they incentivize compulsive behavior. And that's one of the things I worry about. It's like, if you go on, I don't know, Snapchat, 15 days in a row, you get a badge or something like that. I'm not necessarily interested in that. I do like the idea of turning things into games and playful activities, even though I tend not to use gamification because it's kind of loaded now. With sportification, yeah, it's exactly right. I think if you set up a certain amount of incentives or a structure where you're rewarded to really focus on certain things, sometime we can lose the forest through the trees. So I think a good example is like if we use powerlifting as an example. Powerlifters, incredible athletes overall, highly specialized. I think that if you pursue powerlifting up to a certain level, as with any like high level sport, you're going to make certain sacrifices, whether it's on longevity or other capabilities. And I know there are exceptions to that, but if you're going to close your eyes and think of a top level, maybe open weight class powerlifter, that is probably not going to conform with what you think of as like an overall generally healthy and capable person in terms of like being able to climb a tree and run and, express all these different human capabilities. I just think like if powerlifting, if it had evolved slightly differently, and if one of the events was like a weighted pull-up, how much would that change? Or even, CrossFit, I think CrossFit almost got it, but then I think CrossFit kind of sometimes conflated the expression of a skill or capacity with competition. And I think sometimes they got a little confused about things. I mean, there's lots of debate. I don't want to talk about CrossFit. Yeah, but my fear about sportification is like this overemphasis, as you said, on quantification, datafication, things like that. And sometimes people becoming obsessed with the numbers themselves, as opposed to the real world out around them, like the old thing about go outside, touch grass. Like I think for me, the population I work with, I just want to get people outside and moving. And if they find sports that are motivating, I think that's absolutely great. But I think sometimes people forget that the sport is not the whole world, like I think we all know people who've, gotten some kind of self-quantification device and have just become obsessed with running X thousands of meters, a week, or, getting X 10,000 steps or whatever. And then like my favorite is I used to have a client, I remember them walking in, I saw them shaking their device. I'm like, what are you doing? It's like, I didn't get enough steps in today. So I'm just going to go ahead and top it off. And, kind of like as if that makes a difference. So I spat a lot out at you. I'll give you time to respond to that.
Yeah, like there's definitely something to be said for mindful use of language. There is always, there's an early adopter phase for having a new word and being able to move it around. But at some point, putting your foot in the ground, like, look, this is what, getting back to my point, this is what I'm trying to communicate here, whether or not you have a different word. So, for example, I think to take a different tact, things like God and religion are very much loaded terms. But at some point, you can't come up with new words for God. I mean, you can do like spirit and ethos and universe and, Maya and all these different versions. You can you can sweep the dust around the room all you want. But at some point, it's like, okay, this is what I'm trying to communicate. And so when I talk about the context, this is another thing I think is valuable. The context is the thing that gives everything else meaning. Obviously, you are part of creating the context as someone who can experience and act on the world. So it's not just like, oh, this is the room I'm in, therefore this is what I do. But it's a two-way street, a second person narrative, so to speak. And that context, though, helps to organize everything else. So to your point, it doesn't matter if the judge thought it was pretty. It matters if you made it from here to here. And I think there's a realness to that. And so most of the stuff I think we spend time thinking about is really just kind of like twiddling our thumbs, because it's like, okay, there's a thing that actually matters out there. And if you're not sure what that is, then that's a remark on your current inner experience. And I think that's the other issue is it's not the sport. It's just a bar, or in any of these things, it's the deeper issues that people are looking for a sense of acceptance and self-worth and meaning from the number that's also arbitrary. And it's that's the joke about the whole thing is you have to be able to play the game while knowing it's a game. And I think most people can't, you have to lose yourself to the plot in order for the story to advance, but you also have to realize it's a story in order for you not to change to pull yourself out of that, so to speak. And there's a messiness involved with that, where people need to be able to treat powerlifting like it is everything in order to be able to make progress in a way to push through some of these darker spots, like hang-ups and injuries and roadblocks and plateaus, whatever. But you also need to understand it's just a silly bar that you're picking up in order to actually make progress sometimes. And so like being able to play back and forth with this, and you see they push hard with an empty, a loose grip, so to speak. It's like, it's that kind of balance. So to me, that's an interesting way to go about it, but that takes skill. And I think honestly, it's like, that's why I think sports are valuable. The hard part is to me, I would say the issue is not a sport. It's when we confuse a self-contained discipline with a sport in the same way. And so they can be sport in the sense of like, yeah, there's a competition and someone's going to pay you money to do that kind of thing. But not all sports are equal. And this is something I've noodled on work on my next book. But the idea that like there are different categories of sports and each teaches you a different lesson. And I think that's a very important thing to be able to explain, that self-contained disciplines are a different experience. Meaning you can't treat like running, for example, you go for distance running, like that's going to be a different experience, a different thing than anything else. But then it's like soccer, which is like I have to pass to a team and I have to interact and exchange. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, man. I think that makes a lot of sense what you were saying. And I really liked what you said about confusing. Sometimes people tend to confuse maybe the discipline with the sport itself. And it's one of the things that I've really been trying to figure out the balance sometimes, because a lot of what we do is group based. We do a lot of outdoor group movement and things like that. And it's one of the things I'm always not worried about, but I wonder, like, when people do all the group stuff, are they taking the time to sort of develop a personal practice on things as well? And it's my hope that I can instill that in people. But there are definitely things that you can pursue differently if you treat it as a personal practice versus if it's something that you do that's only outward facing or social facing.
Well,
Um,
so not sorry to interrupt, but this is something I've actually
yeah,
been thinking about a lot very recently. So the last 2.5 months, basically we moved and we renovated this house, and I was surrounded by a group of, actually they're all men, but a lot of guys that had tools and skills. And, you know, I here I am kind of in the middle. I was operating as a impromptu project manager and or general contractor, so to speak, just organizing all these people. But I realized quickly, like, what's the point of all this fitness? What do we do? And there's a level of like, we use words like movement and practice and get people out to do this stuff. But like at the end of the day, there's a handful of people who just, I think the hard part is we end up arguing about preferences. And there's a handful of people who use movement as a drug. Exercise is their thing. Like, I got to go get my fix today. I got to beat myself up. They conflate suffering with self-worth, and they think that if they don't beat themselves up enough, they haven't earned their calories for the day. And there's this entire process where people just hate themselves and they don't know how to accept and feel good. So then they use this as a way to create an experience in their life, or they're just so bored with their life and they don't have anything that's really meaningful that like pulls them in there, that they have something in the world that pulls them out of this. And to be fair, that is very difficult to manage in a modern society where we're so smart, our brains are superpowers, and we're just kind of like running on hamster wheels. And so what do? It's drugs, distraction, social media, entertainment. It's just something to give an experience. That's what people just want to feel something. So they eat, they drink, they smoke, they chew, they whatever. It's all this stuff. And so exercise falls in the category of that same itch for most people who are exercise nuts. That does not make it healthy. But the hard part is you pull them back and you want to see this. It's like, okay, there are preferences. There's a maturation of this process where, okay, I used to be an exercise nut. Now I see the light and I can pull back. It's like, well, you kind of bring it. It's difficult to not bring it from the same level of like, I used to be a drug addict, then I found Jesus and now I'm good. But then like 10 years after you did that, now I can have a little bit more of a seasoned approach to how I share the gospel to this. And like, it's the same theme. And I think that's the hard part is you end up getting these conversations where you're talking about like broad, very simple like practice and movement and feeling good and being connected with yourself. And those are all important things. But what I was thinking about in this last few months is like, what is the point of all my fitness? I've spent years, thousands of hours working out for nothing. Like literally, like, okay, you can get injured and lose it in 3 months, but I'm surrounded by these guys who know how to, they know how to build a wall. They know how to put up drywall and install electrical. Like these are actual skills that actually matter in the real world. And all of them involve movement. And I think what we miss is the fact that the lifestyles associated with these occupations are generally pretty bad. And that's not an issue with the job. Yes, some of these, equipment operators just sit around and do nothing, but they're still moving, still engaged. It's the issues that they, stay up late, drink a beer, they don't get good sleep, so they wake up, they hit nicotine and caffeine, and they grab something at the gas station on the way over, then they're just drinking soda throughout the day to keep them up, and then they get tired at the end of the day, and they go home and have something. That's what really kills them. But what I think we also miss is like, there should be an actual skill component. You want to get people involved in a community thing, make them build a house together. Like there's something about that I think we've missed. And I really was reflecting on this on a deep level because I'm like, it was very not humiliating because that's a very word, but it was humbling. That's what I'm looking at. Yeah. To just be surrounded by these people. I'm like, I'm dependent on this. And it's, yeah, sure, I'm in shape and there's something to be said for. And I will say it was one thing that reiterated is like, you need to maintain these basic set of abilities. And there is a rationale and a meaning for training and having something that connects you to movement that is a real world thing. Like, did you make the jump or not? So can you jump, sprint, throw, roll, carry, kick, crawl, carry, which are basic things. And your training is a supplement to that. And there needs to be time for play where you just go and you do something for the sake of it and you have fun doing it, because fun, I think, is the operative word there. But then a lot of your movement should just be connected to like an active life, because otherwise, what's the point? And I really was thinking about that. It's like, man, how many young men go and throw themselves at the gym every day for hours, and they have to the point they're exhausted. Their bodies beat up, they're sore, they're on stimulants to make it happen. And if they took half of that energy to improving their life, literally learning a physical skill, building a wall, improving digging a ditch, whatever it is. Like what would the society be? What would the world be if all these young men actually used that to create something big? And like we had a movement culture that was, instead of going to a gym, show up at the work site today. We're going to go do this stuff. We're going to start with a little bit of warm up. We got a job here. I've got everything organized. Here's their equipment. We're going to do this stuff. And at the end, we're going to go play a game.
Yeah.
That's different, but it's that accomplishes movement, but it's within a meaningful context that actually like does something. And the fact that we have to rely so much on these numbers, it's like, how do I know I did a workout today? Well, I don't know. My Whoop says I did 400 something calories. And it's like, that's not real. It's not a number. I think numbers are real, but they're also not real. It's in your head. It's an abstract, heady concept. And it's like, you have to sit there and prove to me that you did it because you got your 10,000 steps. Like to your point, I think you're on this, but what I would like, what I'm thinking about this, so meaning I agree with you, your perspective 100%. The hard part for me is figuring out a way that doesn't just sound like put it in the soft terms, because that just doesn't attract there's no young man or young woman, I assume, I can't speak for them, but there's no young man that's excited about, like, I want to have a movement practice. And I will say, this is just as well, I continue my rant. You see the social media landscape, and I imagine that most of what you feel is in large part a reaction to what you see, which is what we all see, which is the social media landscape, which is very polarizing because that's literally the message of the medium. It is just designed to create an emotional reaction, which again, people use that. I like it. But you see this idea of like, okay, well, there's guys who are big and strong go play sports and talk about being big and strong. Guys who are skinny and lean and bendy can go do parkour and move. They do rope flow unless you're my friend Nsima, who's also big and strong and does rope flow. But there's a level of like, there's a level of people talk about the thing that if you looked at social media through the lens of everybody talking about their ex-girlfriend they're so mad at, then you'd understand a lot more. It's like they're really just doing the thing focus on, like, it's Becky was just a jerk. I can't believe she did that to me, and now I hate women. It's like, okay, we get that when you see like the red pill, or I don't know what the whole internet sphere thing about men and whatever is on that dark space. But the point is, like, you see it, you're just unhappy. Like, you're just unhappy because you felt like you missed something. And so that is so much of social media, but it creates this conversation around the fact that, like, okay, well, there's people who are meatheads and all they're doing is dumb sports and they want to go and lift heavy weights, or there's like very focused movement practitioners who do yoga and breathing. And it's like, where does the normal person get in on this? And I think that's a problem you're really trying to grapple with this, which I think is beautiful. But what I also think we're missing, because you can enter that conversation as just another player on the court, or you can completely recenter the conversation in a different context, which is, oh yeah, there's a world out there. And oh, well, movement, swinging a hammer is movement. Being able to pull take a ditch out or a bush out of the ground is movement. Like, these are all things that are movement. And it's a very different conversation. Like, did you do something today? And I really want to start to look, and I think that's really what you're getting at. So yes.
Yeah, man, that's good. I mean, like, I'm just going to show, I took loads of notes because you made so many good points. I guess one of the things we can talk about as well is, obviously you look at things through an ancestral lens, and, when you're talking about like how people just need an outlet, I'm thinking about some of the old Desmond Morris stuff and a lot of the people he worked with. So Konrad Lorenz and Nico Teenbergen, I think, all these old ethologists, that a lot of the ancestral stuff is built on. And, Desmond Morris, he wrote this book called The Human Zoo, which I think you kind of have to be worried. Well, you have to be mindful when you talk about it, because I think it influenced Ted Kaczynski quite a lot. But, he kind of has that same argument, is that we have all these surrogate activities because in some ways, we don't really have perhaps these nourishing opportunities in our everyday life, So, these ethologists, they started talking about all these ideas of these, these supernormal, these hypernormal stimuli. And so much of what we do is like such an exaggerated version of what we need. And, Dan John, when he, sometimes when he talks about health and fitness, he's like, look, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. Okay. You're not going to gain immortality, by having like a really good, whatever, score
VO2
on whatever
max.
fitness app. Yeah. Your VO2 max or whatever. Exactly. And like, that's it's kind of inevitable. So like how much of a devil's bargain do people make, as when they decide to go really far in one direction or another? But then what you said is exactly right. You need some kind of motivating, factor. You need some kind of structure, because I agree with you. I think it's very easy to fall too far on one end, where it's just sort of like this vague, some people say movement culture, or, whatever kind of, I don't know, spiritual or sometimes, pseudo spiritual kind of practices there. But you're right. A lot of it isn't based in the real world where we are right now. I interviewed Matthew Remsky about a year ago, and he kind of talks about the history of yoga, and he talks about how it's intertwined with, I don't know, the emergence of modern neoliberalism, if you want to talk about that. But, it was kind of like all these people who kind of dropped out, and obviously this is an oversimplification, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it kind of happened, as yoga culture in the West emerged. It was sort of as all the hippies stopped giving up on trying to change the world, and it just sort of turned into this idea of turning yourself into a personal project, a personal brand, self-improvement, but like, losing this idea that you can actually affect the world around you. In the UK, we have a program called Green Gyms, and it's kind of that. It's like, what if we just got people out and they didn't necessarily exercise, but we just got them out to gardens and allotments, and we got them to do, to help out people, especially if there's some older people that need help moving wheelbarrows and things like that. And, the program's been running for years now. It's been running for well over a decade. I think they find that sometimes they run out of work to do, which is kind of funny. But it makes me think of all the old work projects that they had during the Depression as well, CCC and all that, of just like getting young people out and giving them some meaning through movement.
Well, I think there's two things there. One is you never take the wheelbarrow away from the old people, because that's how old people die, is when you stop giving
That's a
them
good
work and
point.
stuff
Yeah.
to do. But the problem is that the only work that they're probably doing is the only work that's suited for old people, which meaning like you look at all these videos and you see these men climbing the Golden Gate Bridge and sitting up there on the Empire State Building and doing all this like major stuff. It's like, it's dangerous, so this is where like I find myself continuing to divert back to this, but it's like, if you do not have a central motivating ethos around a culture, like an identity, but what you look at is like, well, when you dilute a cultural identity, sure, maybe you're building a human identity, right? It's maybe that's the thing. And in 100 years, we'll have this enlightened, figured out, like who we are as people, right? But when you take away an identity of we're a people that live in this place and feel like this and experience this and had that happen last week, you lose a motivating central ethos, and then you lose a reason to sacrifice. Because what do you sacrifice to? If your sacrifices are either, so for example, you can think of this, I kind of define this mastery versus mediocrity, right? So mastery would be pointing all your efforts towards the highest good. And there are situational versions of that, which is, okay, what I'm trying to do is improve my strength in this capacity so that I improve my speed so I'm a better soccer player, right? So like, okay, I'm making sacrifices by maybe I won't do as much long distance running so I can improve my speed, but that is all in light of this bigger thing. Or I'm disorganized. I'm either organized in my efforts, which point me in the same direction, or I'm disorganized, in which case I fall apart, basically, because I don't have something that centers me as a person. It gives me context in my life. Like, what is the meaning of life? Who am I? Why am I here? Right? Was what we started with. And I think when you start to lose that central ethos of like, we believe this and this is why it matters, then you start to lose the motivation for society's flourish when men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. It's like you lose that idea of like, there's a thing here that I can do that I'm supposed to do, and it's not about me. And when you don't have that story, because it's all about you, because it's your social media, it's your thing, then it's like you become focused on an internal anxiety. So there's you're either focused externally on what you're doing, your action, and that leads to purpose, or you're focused internally on your experience, and that leads to anxiety, because there's no way to act internally. Like you can change, but it really is that. And I think that's the hard part is, okay, it's great going around these community projects, but the big ones cost money. But if we're too worried about everybody being safe and this is where you get like a deeper thing when people are so focused on this, like whether or not, I have my own opinion on this, the idea of an afterlife, I think functions in this way of getting people to buy in on the here and now. Like you might not live today, but you'll see Valhalla tomorrow if you die in battle or in battle kind of thing. It's like, it gets people to think about beyond. That's why I say you have to lose yourself to the plot for the story to advance, but you also have to realize it's a game in order to actually play. And there's that balance is so hard to strike, because if you take yourself too seriously, you get stuck in perpetual training mode, and you never play and you never actually compete. And that's the issue, is like you get stuck in a loop. There's equipment here, there's machinery, and there's things like the idea of an apprenticeship and technicians and trades and being able to do this stuff, but putting money towards that this is where you look at, like, if there was a central organizing entity, aka a government, that could do it. You would want it to arm people to be as effective and able as possible. However, and this is the main focus of the book, that say if there's an underlying like real thought, it's like, what is a human supposed to do? A human adult. What is a standard for a human adult? Okay, you should be able to sprint. That's what I realized. This has to be my stake in the ground. You should be able to sprint. And for the 1% of people who have physical, mental, or emotional disabilities that they can't, understand that, we will make accommodations for you, because a healthy, abundant society is able to do that. For everybody else, I'm looking at you. And that's the thing, is like, because once you put that stable in the ground, you give people an ability to say, this is normal. It's not reserved for the elite few. It's not. And it's also accessible. You don't need equipment. That's why the 100-meter sprint's the most egalitarian event in the entire Olympics. You just line up and you run, and it's beautiful. It's the first event in the first Olympics many years ago. And that idea of giving someone, okay, what are the standard for what you should be able to do? And if you can't do that, we're going to work. And my point of training, the only reason I should see you is because you can't do it. Something's happened, right? You can't sprint. Okay, we're going to work on that. And so there's a stepwise ladder. We're going to go and build up to do that. And once you got that, now you are athletic, meaning you are capable of giving your energy somewhere. Now go do that. And there is no shortage of work to be done in the world. And there is a shortage of people who are interested to do it. And I think that's the hard part, is, to your point. Well, I'll stop there because I think we could go on. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's good. There's a lot. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about, like, from anthropology, when they talk about this idea of tribe, the snake tribe, the wolf tribe, whatever, it's having this shared mythical origin. Whether or not that is true, it doesn't matter, because it's the galvanizing force. You think when modern nation states started to come together in whatever, I don't know, the 1800s, were they myths? Yeah. I mean, they were myths, to a large part, where you decide, like, if someone is a Serb or Croat or et cetera. But, it did create this force so people could organize and they could have a shared story. And I think a lot about Martin Seligman's work. He's a positive psychologist. He has this PERMA model. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's kind of like his question is, what does it take for a society, for a community, for a culture to thrive? And he has all these different ones. But, the M in PERMA, it stands for meaning. It's this idea that you need to feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself, And he also talks about this idea of relationships. And, we've sort of fallen into this trap, I think, some ways, of what I would call the difference between reciprocity and the difference of, service, maybe I'll say transaction, So, what he says is, it's not just about having people do stuff for you, but it's about feeling like you are useful, like you matter, like whether or not you show up has a difference. Like, you have to feel like, you're useful. And it's something Wendell Berry sort of talks about all the time. And anyone who listens to the podcast has heard me talk about this, but, we've lost all these like really important interactions amongst people in communities. It used to be that if you were sick, your neighbor could bring you some soup. If you need help with transportation, you could talk to one of your neighbors. They could give you a ride somewhere. Something like that. And all those were part of like these reciprocal relationships that we had with people. And then I think the tendency has been is that a lot of these things have sort of been replaced by transactions, financial transactions, apps. A lot of these things have been replaced by apps. So what I mean is, if you need a ride now, you call an Uber. It's great, and that more money's going around, but it means you lose that opportunity to knock on your neighbor's door and ask them. Or like if you're sick, rather than your neighbor bringing you some soup or something like that, it means that you order Uber Eats or whatever, and then they come deliver a burrito. So I think there are a lot of systemic forces that sort of make people feel less useful, and I think of like Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. He talks about like, the post-war era, you had all these amazing civic organizations, whether it's like Elks or Rotary, or it doesn't matter. I mean, it could be anything. It could be Freemasons. I don't really care, but these opportunities for people to come together and talk and hash things out and come up with projects and things like that. And I think a lot of people feel like it's impossible now. And, whether it's because, you can make the argument, it's like building regulations have made it too hard to build a new set of stairs or something like that. Or, maybe there's no overemphasis on credentialism and ensuring that everybody has the right certificate, before they can engage in this activity. I'm thinking there's a book, Disabling Professions. And that's kind of like the whole thing. They were talking about this back in the 70s, that when you turn everything into a profession, when you turn everything into a credentialized, I don't know, whatever certificate, it means that normal people feel like they no longer are empowered to engage in these things that we used to do, which I think is interesting, because I don't, it's not a problem with individuals. It's a problem with, I think, incentives at a whole, and, the sort of opportunities that people have to actually rise to something bigger. And I think that right now, as it is, I think perhaps society doesn't provide those opportunities.
Well, within that, there's also a society has become more of a singular thing as opposed to small town cities, neighborhoods, so to speak. You're no longer neighbors with people in the same way, because your neighbors, I mean, you and I are on different continents and we're talking. So there's a level of that which we have yet to really understand. But I don't know if we ever really will. But what it's done is, instead of a million small games, it's turned things into one big game. And so the way you find it's not enough just to be the local doctor. It's like, oh, you have to be the doctor on social media to go talk to. And I think that's the other side. To be fair, it's funny because we talk about these things, but like no one would go back. Like, I know so much more because I have access to information at a broader scale. And so, like, yes, my local doctor knows more. Well, it doesn't matter what my local doctor knows, because I have access to the sum total of medical information at my fingertips. And that creates the downstream is that there's a lot of people getting killed off because they're just, the game is bigger. And I think that's the hard part. Like, for example, I mean, you're talking to me because I have some level of a following on social media, which means I demonstrated a competency over a long enough period of time that was able to garner enough attention that people voted by popular demand or something that said, okay, well, this guy is someone worth listening to. So in some sense, that game is like, we're all playing it. And so it's easy to sit here and say, once you're just a little on top of the game, like for the podcast, like if you had 4 times as many listeners, you would probably have a slightly different perspective on how podcasts and things like that. Like, Joe Rogan's not sitting there complaining about podcasts. It's like, there's a level, it's just what it does. And so I think that's the hard part, is that it's also remembering that the way people are is a reaction to the things that they didn't get, or they felt, get jilted in life. And I think it's the downstream of that is of playing this bigger game, is that people have lost small level meaning, like the little lower case m meaning of like, this is my profession, is what I do. And you are no longer able to, and I'll throw out the one little development. Robert Kagan has got this 5 levels of adult development, but it's like, we're no longer defining ourselves by what our job is. I am a soccer player. That's like a very low level thing. I am a soccer player. It's like, what would you get when you're 8? Like, what do you do? I'm a soccer player. I'm a 3rd grader, and I'm I have a sister. It's like, yeah, but like, what are you as the person in it within it? And I think that's the hard part, is then you do have space for this inner quest of like, well, who am I? What is my purpose? What am I doing? To me, it's all like, at some point, good ideas live on, bad ideas die off. We're in the process of figuring things out in the interim of, okay, there is a human identity that we'll figure out. And that's something in the middle. And I think science and religious ethos and mythological stories and things like that are good, but it's like engaging in the work that is right there in front of you right now is where you redirect people to. And I think there's something about that. It's, I don't know, there's no perfect way to do this whole thing. And that's what I just getting people. It's like, okay, how do we help someone right now? And that's where we look at like, okay, well, you need a standard, and you need a redirecting back to the point is like, you need a standard for what you should be able to do. And that gives you an immediate question of, okay, if I can't do the standard, get to the standard. To circle back and to put all this into context, it seems like there's 2 conversations that need to happen that are both get conflated with one another at the same time. One is, you have to have a standard. What could a human adult be able to do? Okay, that necessarily organizes everything else, because then you're either above the standard or below the standard. If you're not at the standard, you work on the standard. That organizes all physical fitness to, you need to be able to work on this. These are the essential things you should be able to focus on. Therefore, don't worry about your CrossFit class or your Orange Theory or your yoga. It's like, these are the things we need to be able to do to access your basic human abilities. And that would be the entire realm of chiropractic, physical therapy, massage, etc. Like on that side. Then the performance side, once you're there, that's a whole different conversation. How do you apply people to meaning, give access to stuff? That's a fun conversation, because then you can say, what can we do? How can we divert this stuff? And I think the hard part is when we confuse the movement conversation with both of these camps at the same time without a clear standard, it just turns into running in circles. And then it's like, well, you get this idea, we need meaning and purpose. But these are large abstract terms. They don't have any meaning. You know, what gives you meaning is someone shooting at you and you have to figure out what to get back, or someone trying to steal the ball you have from your team. That's absolute meaning. That's the context. You put yourself back in context. But like you said earlier, there's affordances. That comes two ways. What can you do? And what does the context pull from you? And that's the cool thing, is like you can train to work on your abilities. That's all you can do. And then you can put yourself in context that will then give you the next piece of the picture. So this conversation easily turns into just contemplating and like, pontificating about all these options and using big words that just never connect to the average person until you say, okay, this is the standard. This is what you do next. And people action, steps, action gets rid of anxiety.
Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good way of putting it. Going back to just doing the thing. So I want to make sure we set enough time to talk about some questions and also talk about your book, because I want to make sure we get some time on that. So I've got about 15 minutes left. And one of the reasons I got you on here is because you did a series of videos both on Instagram and YouTube, maybe about 7 months ago, I don't know, give or take. And you were talking about moving over to sandbags and perhaps moving away from some of your assumptions you had about bodybuilding or powerlifting or even barbells in general. So without putting words in your mouth, I was just wondering, where are you on that kind of thing now? What's your reasoning? So could you share that with the audience?
Yeah. So I think barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells are fantastic tools in a certain context. But I realized in my specific journey, I had over leveraged them. I just spent 10 years just training with those and I couldn't really do much else. And I ended up, when I lived in the East Coast, my house, I found it had a bunch of rocks all around it. And I got really into like moving these rocks and building little rock walls. And I found like, this is a whole new world to be able to pick up these big boulders and move them around. And like our boulders are the ones I can't pick up, but mini boulders are the ones I could. And so then that kind of led into I moved out here and I was starting to, body back felt stiff. I just wasn't like, I was strong and looked good, but I didn't feel confident. I wasn't moving well. And I started to realize like, there's a whole lot of different types of grips and there's just more flavors to the world. And we talk about the context that can apply at a small level, which is like the thing you're picking up. And if the thing you're picking up doesn't require attention, you won't pay attention to it. With a barbell, you can get under a barbell and not have any core activation whatsoever. But there's different things like odd objects and things that are challenging to move, like a sandbag or just an oversized dumbbell or, any of these things that just would be like a rock, a stone. Well, it's a challenge because you have to like get to know the thing. Like you can't pick up a heavy sandbag. You have to like roll it to the left and the right. You have to get your arms in it. You have to get messy. It's like you have to go on a first date before you even really know a thing. And there's a messiness that I really liked. I'm like, wow, this really is self-explanatory. It's intuitive and it's really challenging. And it's just, I remember carrying this thing pressed into my sternum and that was like, it just felt like you're short of breath. There's just so many things like, wow, it's a fight. You cannot pick up a sandbag unless you're 100% there. And I like tools like that. Lower on the skill level, but they're challenging. Sleds, sandbags, bands for suspension, bands, cables for suspension, and then sprints. It's just like you have to be present. Like those are the 4 main tools that I use, and it's been fantastic. So it's been 2 years since I really even touched a barbell, and about a year since I used a dumbbell. Again, nothing's wrong with those. Personally, I'm testing out a little bit more of a hypothesis. Being someone that's more of a figurehead, so to speak, you have to be able to kind of like test hypotheses and run with them a little bit longer. So I'm like, all right, if I just focus on gymnastics training and sandbags, sleds, sprints, and then, I got some maces and clubs and maybe some bands and stuff like that. But if I don't use barbells or dumbbells or kettlebells, and nothing wrong with kettlebells, but I just haven't felt the need. But if I don't use barbells and dumbbells, do I die? Do I lose all my muscle? Do I get, it's like, and so far I haven't. I've gotten stronger and more capable, and it's been very interesting. So I highly recommend, if there's one tool, like from a physical thing, using a sandbag, if you have it at the gym, it could be a backpack full of books, could be a 50-pound bag of play sand. Incorporating that, it pulls your body into context immediately. And all of a sudden your core is working. You don't have to create if you have to create artificial tension to do something, it's not an interaction anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one thing I think about all the time is how much gym movements are just like pantomiming a certain specific form, even if that's not actually what the object or the implement needs.
Yeah. Well, I will say too, I did a lot of jujitsu. Has been one of my main interests in the last 4 years. Uh, the thing with jujitsu is you realize there's different types of strength and your ability to actually like move. So if you, to your point of movements in the gym that are pantomiming things, it's like, ironically, if you go to a gym, it's finding the hardest way to move. I'm gonna do a leg extension. That's the hardest way to move a weight is so I'm gonna try and find the hardest way to move a weight with this muscle. It's a lateral raise. It's the hardest way to pick up something just using your shoulder. And there's a whole, and this is what I was thinking a lot about with the guys out doing work is like, I can get down there and pick up these long 2x4x10 or 2x4x12s with long beams and pull bushes and pick up rocks and do stuff. And it's like, because I've been training like that for a while, and it's like, oh, I see the context of this, but they are not interested in how hard you make it. They're interested in how much leverage, how well can I do this? And I think that's a whole different focus, which is, can I move the thing? Not can I make it hard? And I think that hard is a very insidious concept in modern fitness culture.
It's one of the things I think about a lot. I used to talk about like moving like a craftsman, and like what kind of makes a movement efficient or not. It's like, where do you find the resting place? So like when people talk about all the various kinds of cleans, well, what is a clean? Well, a clean is picking up something heavy below your hips and finding a resting position for it. It doesn't really matter what the rack looks like, whether it's, Zercher, front rack, kettlebell rack, whatever. Yeah, there's some movements, you're exactly right, where people just sort of focus on isolating, whatever particular muscle it is versus, again, going back to this idea of doing the thing. And yeah, what you said about sandbags, I found to be true as well, where like, you kind of said they're relatively low skill. And I know exactly what you mean by that as compared to an Olympic snatch or something like that. Yeah, I'd say they're like low specialization, but very high transfer. It's just like the generalizability, which is an ugly word, is just, very high in them. You said someone in one of your blogs or one of your videos, you're like, how much does a couch weigh? No one cares how much a couch weighs when you're moving it. It's just like, can you move the couch?
Yep.
You don't micro load up to getting to the point where you can move the exact weight of moving a couch. It's just you build that capacity. How do you make this kind of training meaningful? Because like I think for so many people who've grown up at the gym and gym programs, they're used to like micro progressions and linear, progression, adding, whatever, 2.5 pounds to the bar every time or whatever. When you kind of step away from that, how do you make sense of it all?
That's a great question. How do you make this meaningful? I would say it goes the other way around. So the meaning is what motivates someone to care about this thing. So then I would say, why do you care about it? What's important what does strength mean to you? And what do you not feel strong enough to do in your life? It is one way. And to me, I didn't even have to ask that question because it's always the pain, right? So the reason I am interested in working with people in pain is because it shows that they are at an inflection point where they're ready to change. Their body has some level of connection with their conscious experience or unconscious experience that has now gotten to the point where their movement no longer matches the moment and they are ready to do something different. And so pain to me is saying, okay, there is something that's going on here. And so the question is, what part is not organized to this movement that maps to the thing you want to have happen in your life? Oftentimes people do not know what they want in life. And not that they don't, they just never either thought about it or they felt it's off limits. Again, so we go back, okay, without that specific individual purpose, let's just focus on the standard. Let's get you back to sprinting. And along the way, you will change. I do believe that as your body expands, your mind, it opens up space to your mind as well. That's how childhood development happens. I don't think it stops. I just think we stop trying to continue or to maintain a physical capacity. So then the question is, how do you find there's a difference of how do you keep sandbag training interesting? That's a different question than how do you make it meaning? Because the meaning is like a personal content. Like, what are you going to plug that into your life? And it's really just saying, there's a short answer, which is you make it a competition, which is you get, I bet two more people gather together, therefore I am as well. You say, all right, we're going to show up and we're going to, I bet you can't lift that one. And I bet you can't lift this one. And you pick it up. That's why the culture, for where you are, there's like a long culture of lifting stones, it's pick it up. What is that other than, I bet you can't do that. Oh man, look what I can do kind of thing. And so you make it, and that's the cool thing is because sandbags are very, then people aren't used to them. So it's different. It's like, oh, that's a little, maybe I could try that, because nobody knows exactly what it is. The question is, once you've done it, how do you keep going back to doing that? And that's, I've had some interesting thoughts about training recently, because it's just a level of, you have kids, you get busier, but it's like, okay, what's the least amount of work I can do here and maintain my strength? Because it's like, if you care about the abstract ability to lift a certain amount of weight 8 times in a row, then like, and by abstract, I don't mean that the actual task is there, but your ego, the identity, the value you've assigned to this, and also the number is really abstract. You're thinking about it. And really, you don't think about it in the moment. You're just thinking, because what you're thinking about is, one, can I lift this again right now? Like, just not even again. Can I do this right now in this moment? And then in your head, you're running, well, I got 7 more. I got 6. That's all in your head. So like, the entire concept of adding anything more than right now is made up. So, wow, I'm going to see, I wonder if I could do 5 more pounds. That's 5. That's, it's like that whole thing is just in your head. And the beauty of sandbags is like, I don't know exactly how much is in this. I think it's about this weight, but it's, there's a rough label on there, and it gets people out of the idea of like perfect numbers, and that gets them back into like doing this thing. And so, by nature, the thing itself gets you out of over analyzing, and it just gets you into like, let's pick this thing up. But from a training perspective, I've really questioned again, I don't say this because like, I think the reason I would struggle to train like a professional fighter or a professional athlete is because I've struggled to see people as just a commodity, a single thing. Oh, we're going to focus on your strength at the expense of something else. I'm like, that's not smart. I don't want to do that to people. I see you as more than. Doesn't mean that we can't have fun and get into the nitty gritty details and play that game. That's totally fine. But there's a level of like, I think people really underestimate how much a good night's sleep, being in a good mood, having eaten something that whether it's having good fuel and just being excited about it, boost your strength so much more than anything else. And so like we like to treat ourselves like machines and show up and do this thing again. So that's where we get in the whole question about like programming and micro progressions. But like, man, you're just being in a good mood, enjoying what you do, and having a good environment, having some buddies around with some loud music and playing and enjoying this thing and make it a competitive. It will pull more from you than any perfect program could. And once you've done it, half the issue is once you've done it, half the issue is, I don't know if I can do it. And so there's a question of like, well, once you know you can do it, a man climbs a mountain, wants to see if he can do it twice, prove it wasn't or something like that, whatever, twice to prove it wasn't a fluke. Yeah. But like, there's something there, it's hard because I don't know the answer to this, because there is real tissue change that happens with repeated exposure. But the strength is not totally reliant on that. So yes, you do need tissue that can maintain it, but if you understand leverage and how to put yourself in the right position, that's a big game right there. And so like, I don't have the answer for how to continue to program this stuff. All I know is that once I do something, I go back and do it a few more times, and I just only lift something if it's interesting to me. And then I'll go back and like, some days I feel good and I go and pick up the heavy one, and doing that, I've gotten to the point I can pick up and squat a 300-pound sandbag. And it wasn't like I did 275, 3 sets of 6 and I just kind of like messed around with it and picked it. It came back and they tried to pick it up again a little bit more, and then it came back and picked it up again a little bit more. And then like, I just felt good one day, like, I'm going to pick this up, and I just did it. And it was like, so I don't know. I think what I'm getting at with this jumbled answer is that there is value in having some type of program, because it gives you structure and it gets you to like stick into something. However, I think that value pretty much stops there, because the majority of it is your perception of the problem. And if you perceive this to be in the United Kingdom, or sorry, any place that uses the metric system, 2 plates on the bar is 220 pounds. In the United States, that's 225 pounds. That 5 pounds makes a big difference for people because they think it matters. And it's like, okay, you can hit 220 or 205 or 215 and I can't get it. For years, my 1 rep max on a back squat was 385 pounds. I could hit a set of 10 at 355 pounds. That should not make sense. Like but I was such a mental block. If I put that on, I got immediately locked. It's like, okay, it's all, so I just am continuing to question that as I go. But to me, it seems like there's a lot more at play than just following the perfect program.
I want to make sure we talk about your book a little bit. And back at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about the evolution of some of your thought. You said that over the process of writing the book, you kind of narrowed down, those 28 original capacities you had down to 10 capacities or capabilities.
Mm.
Um, but in the last few minutes, I just wanted you to kind of talk about the process of writing the book, kind of what your motivation was behind it, what gap you think it fills, and then also just, what you learned over the process of writing the book.
I will say that every program I've made, I also wrote a book with it, because writing is kind of how I constrain my brain to be able to focus on
Mm.
something and have a very cohesive thought. So the questions you asked that I've thought about, I answered well. The questions you asked that I have to put some thinking, or I'm still contemplating, a little more jumbled. And so writing for me is really important, because I otherwise have a very dynamic brain. Let's just say it that way.
Mm.
So the interest was in. It took a while, actually. The book company reached out to me, and I first sent them an idea, and I was like, hey, I'd like to be able to do this. And like, that sounds great, but it's not really in our wheelhouse. I was like, okay. And so then I took about 6 months and thought a little bit more. I was like, actually, they got a good point. Like, that's a little bit too broad. And there's a book I could write that is based off of the things that I've focused on and learned the last decade. And that's when Born to Sprint, I saw the title, and it just emerged to me, so to speak.
Mm.
And it turned it into this exploration of like, it's a 7-chapter process. The first is some stories, basically connecting at a human level with different struggles, different situations, and improving, giving them a hope about the possibility again. Second is a brief overview of the major systems of physiology and how the body works. Because if you have a visualization for how the tissue is, it kind of demystifies a lot of the, well, I tore my ACL 5 years ago, and it's never been. It's like once you understand the living force of fascia that fills your body, that's a whole different perception. Step 3 goes through the foot, hip, and the shoulder programs, basically with 100 mobilizations that teach you how to feel every part of your body, to wake up and experience it. It's not sets of 10 and doing this as a program. It's feel this, because once you feel this, you store this awareness back into your tissue. Step 4 organizes in tissue chains, which built off of Thomas Meyer's anatomy, your fascial lines, and Philip Beach's meridians, and all these different brilliant thinkers that have come before, and trying to organize it to a simple context that takes these pieces, maps them into patterns. Chapter 5 then organizes this 10-step process back to sprinting. And that's really where I started to hone those 28 steps, 28 days of the backyard athlete into like, okay, actually there's a progression here, and there's categories with this. And those, you go from sitting on the ground, being able to be on the floor, so sitting, resting, relaxing, so to speak, to crawling, which is the next step of locomotion, being able to move your hips and your arms, what babies do. Then it moves on to walking, which is basically balance, standing on one foot, being able to use your feet actively to stand and move well. Then we get to stabilizing, which is where I use gymnastics-based calisthenics and sandbags as the two tools to stabilize and create hold your position. Then you get into throwing and kicking, which are basically using your limbs as independent things. Can you allow your shoulder to move freely and to project something from your body? Can you allow your hip to move freely and project something from your body? And so that's where you're dissociating those limbs from your torso. You move into rhythm, which is the step 7. Can you hold a beat? And that's really powerful. It's one of the things that dance is so important, but it's also, at the very level, can you skip? Then you start to add some power to that, and you get some bounce, and you're thinking of plyometrics. Can I repeatedly absorb a force and impact? And that's a very essential thing for bones and connective tissue. You move on to jumping, which is can I accelerate and decelerate force effectively? And then finally sprinting, which is can I pull all these together for single leg loading rapidly with rapidity that manages to handle an intense amount of force. Chapter 6 goes into this idea of perception and how movement is not just a thing that you do, it's also something called forth from you. And so that's a piece we've discussed at length today. And then chapter 7 is basically more of a program, like practical, tangible steps and protocols for how do you put this together. So that was the process of the book. And the gap I think it fills is it both suggests a standard and gives you a proven roadmap to get there, and to understand it, to know why, how, and what to do to get to that point. And so the goal is to be able, it's called Born in a Sprint, is to remind you of this heritage and your basic human ability and give you a roadmap to get there. And from that point, then it's a much more fun conversation. So it really was born out of years of working with people in pain, that they're really struggling, not sure how to plug in, that had been failed by the modern mainstream medical insurance productization of everything. And then that doesn't necessarily tackle the whole, like, how do you plug this into fitness? That'll be the focus of the next book, meaning how do you tackle the fitness culture and put this into context? But it does give people a step of like, okay, this is a thing I should focus on right now.
That's good, man. I mean, there's so many things you touched on. I love hearing how people make sense of these problems. The old parable about the blindfolded men touching the elephant. This looks like a snake. This looks like a trunk, whatever. And this idea of like kind of tackling capacity and movement, it can get so nebulous. But the way you broke that down makes a lot of sense. And it's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot as well, especially when you're talking about beat and rhythm. It's like, I spend all this time lifting weights and things like that. But like, I see myself when I try to dance or something like that, and it's just like something I just never built up, and I've used all these excuses to avoid it, but it's something that I see more and more. I've been avoiding it. So I'm glad that's something you built into it. And I'm interested about the next book, because you said it's kind of talking about aspects of the culture of the fitness industry, which is something I always like to interrogate as well. But you've been generous. You let me go a little bit over today. I want to make sure we don't get another tangent. I'll leave that for another episode. Anyway, Graham Tuttle, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
All right, so that was my interview with Graham Tuttle, the barefoot sprinter. Hope you enjoyed that one. Yeah, it was really interesting speaking with Graham. It actually ended up being a really long conversation, and I tried to edit it down to fit into about an hour and 10 minutes or so. One of the things I really enjoyed about the conversation with him is that even though, we talk about capacities and building options and things like that, like I said, we really look at it from the point of community building or just working with regular people and trying to increase their options so they can live lives that they want to live. And Graham does a lot of that as well, but he also focuses a bit on performance. And, he does think about working, I would say, with more performance-based or maybe even elite athletes or people who really want to focus on the top end performance. So it was interesting to see how two people who have similar views, but also kind of on, if not opposite ends of the spectrum, on disparate ends of the spectrum, to see how they take those same ideas and apply them in slightly different ways. So I hope you enjoyed that one. As always, please leave us a nice review, also with comments on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or however you really listen to podcasts. And next one should be coming out in another week or so.